So there's been a lot of talk and fear and paranoia about a third world war scenario unfolding. First, it was North Korea a couple of years ago that people were talking about here in the U.S. Then it was Iran last year. People were afraid that Iran and the U.S. that confrontation that happened would turn into a third world war, between these nuclear powers. And then now, I'm hearing a sort of similar conversation about China now, that people are afraid that, this latest sort of confrontation between China and the US could turn into a larger, full blown war. And if you're listening to this in the future, I wouldn't be surprised at all. In fact, I'd probably be willing to make a money bet that there's going to be another situation that people interpret as a potential for a third world war. Either this China thing or it could be another country, but um, and I don't want to apply my judgment on people who think those things, because again, like, there is a reason for it. It does resonate with a lot of people for a few different reasons that I could see. But basically, what I can see and what I understand is that there's not going to be a third world war in the conventional sense in the foreseeable future. There is just not. Yeah, there's been a lot of stuff happening that people aren't aware of, apparently. Um, so if you look back for thousands of years, for countless millennia, humans, fought with each other. They battled in pretty much the same way. You had cities or even just tribes that would fight over land or resources or whatever, and they would fight with soldiers, and it was pretty direct combat. It was pretty simplistic usually. Different kinds of people might have different strategies, or some of their technology might be slightly better than the other. They might have better swords or, weaponry of whatever type they use. But it was basically just direct combat. Me fighting you, our towns fighting, and that's had some various implications. We as humans remember that, in a sense. You have this instinctive knowledge, I guess, or your instincts in general. Where do instincts come from? They come from your ancestors and your past lives, if you believe in that. But it's a combination of past lives and your ancestors. It's in your DNA. So many of us are coming from backgrounds where we lived during times of war, and of course, I don't want to sound naive. There are definitely parts of the world where there's still ongoing war, and there hasn't been a lot of peace and stability. But for a lot of us in the developed world, we've been blessed enough to experience a long period of relative stability, especially in America. But even in Europe since World War II, it's been relatively stable. And but the thing is, we're coming out of thousands and thousands of years of persecution and fear and chaos and death and disease, and one calamity after another, one war after another, um, and a lot of people are used to it. Obviously, no one wants to be in that kind of reality, but it's sort of like someone who's lived with an abuser, someone who physically abuses them. They can become entrained with that and expect it and even manifest it. Even if they're not living with the person who physically hurt them anymore, they might constantly expect it, and they might even unintentionally create situations. Like, I don't know if that's making sense at all, but that's basically what's happening. People are rightfully scared, and it's just with that DNA memory. If you've experienced thousands of years of something, it's hard not to expect it'll happen again. So that's kind of what's happening now. Part of it is just the media likes to work people up, but people, it works, and that's part of the reason why. But a second thing is that it would be an oversimplification to say that there's simply no war going on at all. And I know that sounds contradictory, but basically what it is So let's go back to what I was saying, where for thousands of years you had direct combat. War was fought basically the same way. People there, you could get strategic with it. I'm sure. I'm not like a war history expert. I'm sure there were, there's battle strategy, but it was like ultimately it was basically just direct combat. Um, but that sort of changed in during the Cold War. The whole point of it being called a Cold War as opposed to a hot war. I don't think there were a lot of situations like that in the past where I could be wrong, but basically there's this tendency that there's this increasing pattern throughout history where wars, of course, wars are still fought the old-fashioned way, direct combat in some parts of the world, but more and more, again, this really got going during the Cold War, but more and more war is fought indirectly, and it's this is for many different reasons. It's part of us as a species sort of maturing. I think it's one step. It's natural to start out warring with each other, and then eventually that war turns into economic war, or when they say trade war, it's not just a catchy name. It's really a trade war. You're fighting, or when they uh, enact sanctions on a country, I think us as Americans, or probably anyone, are sort of familiar with the idea of sanctions, but I don't think we really understand what that means. So if the U.S., especially the U.S., since we trade so much with so many different countries, but when we say we are putting sanctions on Iran, that means not only are we not trading them with them, but we're not going to trade with any country that trades with them. So that basically just cripples the country. That's why you have people starving in certain countries like Iran, uh, because the whole world is basically like boycotting them, won't trade with them. So unless they can produce everything, within their country, with which very few countries are capable of doing, very few countries have the land or the resources to supply everything there on their own soil for their people. They've got to import one thing or another. It's hard to maintain a modern economy with no imports. So that's just one example of warfare. But there's these many other different ways of fighting. So during the Cold War, um, you know, the I don't want to devolve into this huge history lecture. That's not what this is going to be. But some of this is important if you want to understand what's going on now. So just real quick, so just an example of what was happening during the Cold War. Basically, what it was, uh, of course, the Soviet Union and the U.S. never engaged in a battle at all, but there were lots of battles. Basically, the U.S. might fund certain rebel groups or certain, in various parts of the world. That's where you get the idea of first world, second world, third world. People say those terms a lot, but they don't really know what that means. The first world was the Western democratic world. The second world was the Soviet world, which is basically everything behind the Iron Curtain. So all the former Soviet nations, basically, and then the countries that their influence that communism had spread to. And then the third world was basically just everywhere else, which hadn't developed as much yet. So it was basically Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia, and in the eyes of the first world and the second world, or led by America and the Soviet Union, the third world was up for grabs. So the idea, each one feared that the other one would conquer, not conquer, but um, like the U.S. was of course afraid that the Soviets would that communism would spread throughout Asia and Africa, and that all those countries would be on Russia's side or the Soviet Union side, and then they'd be against us. And then I'm sure the Soviets feared the same thing of the U.S., that our ideology would spread to all of the third world. So basically, there were these proxy battles fought in various places in Afghanistan, and the Korean War is sort of an example of that, and in various places around the world in Latin America. Um, but basically, what it is like each country. It's war is messy. It's expensive. You lose good soldiers. You lose those lives, which if you're just looking at it objectively and not even just not taking into account those lives. But if you're looking at it from like a purely militaristic standpoint, it's messy to lose lives. You need those people to be workers or whatever for your country, and you lose lives. You pour tons of money in it. It's extremely expensive, um, and so even if you win a war, you're still losing a lot in it if in direct battle. So that's why these wars are fought so indirectly, because if you can conquer a country or take over certain aspects of that nation without them knowing it, that's a huge advantage. Or if you can do it in ways that not only don't, if you can do it in ways that are not only not exuberantly expensive, but also possibly ways that make money for your country, that would be extremely attractive for your military strategy. Um, and again, I keep bringing up the Soviet Union, but the Soviet Union and the U.S. fought proxy battles, so smaller battles through other countries, and then they also more and more of it is less fought through violence and more fought through psychology, information, and money, basically. And if you understand that, that's really key to what's going on. Why would you've got to think these people are just completely stupid if you think that they're gonna nuke each other. Nobody wants that. Nobody wants that. And no one wants that. The people of any government are basically smarter than that, and I really truly mean that. I'm not exaggerating. Nobody, like any country knows that if you throw a nuke at another country that has nukes, that they'll retaliate, and it's just a lot of totally unnecessary destruction. That's really not in anyone's interest. So like I said, if you can get on the inside, and that's basically what's happened. That certain powers in the world have created more and more advanced ways of indirect warfare or quiet warfare. Um, so is there going to be a third world war? No, but you could argue that there is one happening. That it's not just a cold war, but that it's a really cold war. It's not even cold. It's transparent. It's not transparent. It's an extremely indirect war. And if you look at it that way, I would argue that there's two main wars going on right now that are not militaristic in nature. One is a civil war happening in America right now that is based on information. It's a civil war between realities, essentially, between how people look at reality and how they are informed, between information, a media war. And then the second war is between, I'm not sure if I can even talk about this on YouTube, but I mean, China has even said it, so I don't think it's much of a secret. And I think people are catching on now that they have purposely, well, it started after World War II. After World War II, Europe and Asia were basically destroyed, and the U.S. remained intact. Of course, we hadn't suffered war being fought in our area. We had a lot of infrastructure. So the strategy was that we wanted allies. And so if we could aid in the building up of these countries in Europe and Asia, that they would befriend us. They would have democracy and capitalism, and we could be friends. They would be our strongest allies. And this worked very successfully in Europe and Japan and South Korea. We gave them, we traded with them. We gave them lots of technology. We did a lot of trades that were very much in their favor, but we knew that it was part of the strategy. That worked really well. We also provided military, for these countries to give them time to rebuild. So we were being really nice in that sense, but it was definitely strategic. It was so that we would have strong allies. And like I said, that worked very well in certain countries. But China was one exception because the political leaders of China over the decades have chosen that they do not want to follow the path of South Korea or China or Germany. Um, that they don't want to follow the U.S., that they believe it's their time to sort of rule the world through, through technology and through communism. They've basically taken some of the elements that work best from capitalism and then taken some of the elements that work best from authoritarian governments and combined them. In many senses, they're more capitalist than we are because they don't have regulation. They don't have economic regulation like at all. So you can have a cutthroat business. You can sell things that are poisonous or that and that's why we've had so many defective products. Especially on Amazon, which all this stuff comes from China and it's defective. It kills the family dog. There's been tons of recalls of this stuff. Or the technology stops working after a few months or maybe a year. It's timed. All this kind of shoddy merchandise has come from the system because like I said, they have this extremely authoritarian government where if you own a business in China, you can do whatever you want as long as you don't interfere with the Communist Party. And if your business becomes very successful and very large, you're required to share. All businesses in China are required to share all their information with the government. So if you become very large, the government takes notice and interest in you, and you become more and more sort of a puppet of the Chinese Communist Party in that country. And so they have very direct control, and that allows them to have very long-term strategy. That totalitarian power, that they don't have to worry about the upcoming election. They don't have to worry about trying to get elected. Um, so in a way, it's kind of ingenious system, and they've taken a lot of our information, and we have been, as a country, as a government, I guess. Um, the government tried that strategy that I described before, and I think our leaders have been very slow to realize that we're just being taken advantage of, and even Condoleezza Rice seemed to admit that China was working against us even as early as 2010, and yet there was no action taken on changing our stance with them at all. You maybe thinking about this almost like on an emotional or metaphysical level, like if we as a country as the government, if we had stronger boundaries with China and made it clear to them, not just giving all our stuff away willy nilly, but had more proper boundaries with them, maybe the situation wouldn't have happened in the first place. Um, but basically, what the situation is that have they've corrupted our universities, and they have these very indirect ways of affecting our society. Like there's that video talking about how the Chinese Communist Party very directly influences our movies and changes, sort of indirectly, but also pretty very directly, has attitudes which result in our movies being changed to fit their narrative. Um, so anyway, so we've been slow to realize this, but that's what's happening basically. Um, is there going to be a third world war? No, but China has been aiming to take over the world basically. They do these deals, the One Belt One Road initiative, where will they'll go to third world countries like Sri Lanka or the African countries, and certain countries that the Western powers wouldn't help because let's say they have well a lot of smaller countries in the world, maybe their leaders don't respect human rights, so they have human rights violations, and maybe they don't want to go the democratic route. They want to the people in power want absolute power, so they don't get help from these stronger Western countries. But then China comes along. China says, "Hey, we're not going to give you charity. We're going to give you a loan so that you can develop your country. You can build a huge harbor, or you can build, infrastructure in your country. We'll give you a loan. We'll help you out, and we don't care about your human rights things because like we've got our own human rights issues." That's what China says, and this is very attractive to a lot of countries, so they go with it. And a lot of these loans are very large, and the Chinese might even know or suspect that this country will default on the loan. Or that's basically what's happened. And then once the country defaults on the loans and can't pay it back, China says, "Oh, okay, no big deal. Just allow us to use your harbor, like in Sri Lanka. Just let us use your deep sea harbor." So now, without even declaring war, without even having to mobilize troops or detonate a nuke, they've gained control of a harbor in Sri Lanka. So an island off the coast of India facing the Indian Ocean. So now India can essentially operate not only from their coastline on the Pacific Ocean, now they can operate on the Indian Ocean. And in many ways, this is like a big chess game, except it's complicated chess and a lot of it's indirect. Like I said, they're taking over infrastructure in the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and Africa in these ways. They've taken over certain aspects of our society, by buying a lot of companies' stock in American companies. Because if you own more than half of the stock of a company, you do have a lot of control over that company. And so, like for instance, these companies which are involved in our communication, like Facebook, YouTube, Google, if you can control, or Twitter, if you can control those companies, it's sort of like a backdoor around the First Amendment. Was it the First Amendment? Freedom of speech, where the founders, the people who wrote the Constitution, suspected that it would be our government that would be trying to crack down and inhibit our rights. So that's sort of how the Constitution was designed. They didn't foresee that it would be companies that would be providing our forms of communication. And so that's sort of a gray area or a loophole in terms of our constitutional rights, because like I said, they thought that the government would be inhibiting our freedom, our free speech. They didn't foresee that it would be more in the hands of companies, and that these companies could be influenced by certain powers that be. Okay, so that's what's going on, and there's something else I was going to say that I forgot. There's a civil war going on, which I talked about a little bit. That's another thing that people have brought up. Is there going to be a civil war? And to me, I just imagine Americans like fighting each other. I think a lot of times talking about politics can be awkward with people and people can be heated. I don't think we want to kill each other though, and I don't think we're anywhere close to that. So the thought of us engaging in battle against each other on the streets just seems very far-fetched to me, to be honest. However, again, I think the idea resonates with people because on one level there is a civil war already happening in this country. It's a war of narratives, of ideas, of beliefs and thought, and it's basically different perspectives of reality. And this applies to every issue. This, like any issue, you could start with maybe the obvious things like, the I shouldn't name them off because I'm gonna get flagged or whatever. But if you start with the typical political issues that rile people up, the obvious ones that are different, that are separated by political party, it's obvious that there's a different narrative on either side, and that either side has a very convincing argument and has all these reasons. But there's this narrative applied to everything, and you could see this in current events. And I don't think enough people listen to both sides. Listen to the mainstream media, or listen to the more liberal forms of media, and listen to conservative media, and you'll learn a lot. Because there are some things that they'll both say. There's some things that neither will say. Neither side is pure at all, but you can gain a lot of perspective from listening to both. But essentially, yeah, a large part of our country has been compromised, and I think it's going to work out, because it has to work out. Because, again, going back to that cellular memory, a lot of these themes have already happened before, and we've already experienced this on a certain level. And during past cycles, we've experienced very similar themes to this, that where essentially it ended up not working out. The experiment failed. This happened with Atlantis. It happened with Rome. People compare America to Rome. In many ways, America was like Rome, but Rome was also like Atlantis. They're all three are sort of a similar uh, soul experiment, or a combination of archetypes and themes. And this time, it might be tempting to go into fear and think that the world is going to end, which I think is another thing that people haven't really thought about. The world doesn't end. Like, what does that even mean? Even if there's a nuclear war, which I don't think there's going to be, but hypothetically, even if you nuke the place, the world wouldn't end. I mean, Earth would still be there. Life would still be there in some way. There'd be a lot of devastation. Even if people go extinct, the Earth would go on. And I mean, so I think when people think about the end of the world, you have to be more specific. I mean, in the 1200s, there was the plague and there was the Mongol invasion, where, so many people died. I think half of all people died uh, between the Mongol invasion across Europe and Asia, plus the plagues. And people did think that the world was ending, and in many ways it did. Like, it did end. But then it also kept going. Like, so what do you mean when you're saying the world ends? I just don't really understand what that means. But at any rate, these are some of my thinking about these issues. I just feel like there's something I'm forgetting to say, but I guess I'll just make another video if I remember it. So yeah, that's basically my thoughts on World War Three. There's not gonna be a direct. I could talk a little bit more about what I was actually saying. I know that because there is an agenda. There are forces which sort of organize. Well, historically, there are sources which organized wars. So if you look at all the major wars, World War Two, World War One, um, I can't remember the name, but there's a major war before World War One involving a lot of the European powers. But if you look at both sides involved of any of these wars, and you look at who funded either side, or who is really at the top, like the most powerful on either side, if you follow the chain of command or follow the money, they lead you back to the same place. So it'll be the same people funding both sides, or the same, or certain people doing business with both sides, certain people that benefit greatly from the war, from aiding both sides, and basically these things are organized. And the powers that be, who have historically organized these wars, have basically come out and said that they don't need war anymore. They have other means of achieving their goals. Like I said, economic manipulation, psychological manipulation, propaganda, controlling thoughts. That's what they're really interested in now. Controlling what you think and how you think and what you think about. And there will be programs developed in the near future with the intention of mind control. And by mind control, I mean like direct, being able to read your thoughts and control your thoughts. There are definitely people that are very interested in instilling this technology on Earth. And, it's through all these methods that they don't need a direct war anymore. Through all the economic manipulation, a lot of it's through loans and money, inflation. So, and another thing too, something that is very relevant to this conversation, which I've noticed in history, is that a lot of times, so when each country develops, it has a population boom, and the later it develops, the larger its population boom is. And a lot of times, historically, when a country develops, so like, okay, so for instance, the first one was France, first country to develop, where they reached this threshold where they had enough technology and enough advanced medicine and enough food where their population just started skyrocketing relatively. It started going up exponentially. And during that time, they had a population is an advantage against other countries. If you have a higher population, you could, if you are looking at it from a more direct militaristic perspective, if you've got more soldiers, you could probably win. So that's what happened with the Napoleonic Wars. France pretty much almost took over. It did take over a lot of Europe and almost took over all of it. That was right after they developed, when their population was skyrocketing. And then after that, what happened? They sort of lost their power, and then they become infamous for losing like every war after that. But after that, you had right after France, England was the second one. And what did England do? England did basically take over the whole world. They had the largest empire ever, I think, where the sun never set on the English Empire. It was because they were having this. They had just developed. They had this population boom, and then what happened after that? The population subsided, and they lost their power. The third power was the U.S., and that differs from these other countries, and I'll tell you why. So, with the U.S., we developed right after France and England, or kind of the same time. Were inventing things more because we had a system which was more conducive to developing new technology. So ours was slightly different. We had a lot of technologies being developed here that were either being invented at the same time in France and England, or that we were coming up with our own. And so we had that population boom. But what was different in the U.S. was that we had a form of government and a form of society which was much more beneficial to the common people, which was extremely attractive to people all over the world, and that's where immigrants started pouring in. And so I think immigrants started kind of pouring in. Well, there were waves for sure in the 1800s, but then it really got going after 1900. And this was a huge, instead of our populations going up and then subsiding like it did in these other, European countries, ours just kept going up. Even as the birth rate declined, and we haven't had a birth rate high enough to replenish the same population, but our population keeps growing anyway because of all the immigrants, and the immigrants are coming here because of all the freedom and economic prosperity here. That our society was basically superior to these other countries. That was why America could have so much dominance for such a long time during the 1900s. And and we were also the first country that didn't want to just take over the world in a direct militaristic way, not like these other powers could have or would have wanted if they had our same stance. But that was, part of the whole thing, was that our whole system wasn't like the ones before. That we were about uplifting people and letting people decide their own fate. So anyway, but right after that, well, no, I shouldn't say right after that, but one of the next major players that developed after France, England, and the U.S. was Germany. And in the early 1900s, Germany reached that threshold point where their population went up a lot, and they did want to they basically wanted to do what Spain, France, and England had done before them. They wanted to sort of take over the world, and this would be more normal and maybe not thought of so much if they had done it a couple hundred years earlier, or maybe even 100 years earlier. But their timing was off. Things were becoming more peaceful, and more countries were doing business peacefully. So Germany was a little bit late to the game and very violent and genocidal. Is genocidal a word? I don't know, but so they had this population boom, and then what happened? Of course, I don't think they lost World War II because their population was subsiding, but they did lose their power, much like these other countries, although faster. And they just hit it too hard, too late, basically. But it was a similar pattern that these other countries had played out before. Okay, so anyways, this is getting long, but where I'm going with this is one of the next major players to develop has been China. And again, I think I did mention where the later a country develops, the higher its population is going to be. Um, so, for example, if Africa develops in my lifetime, they will have the highest population in the African countries. Niger, I don't know how to say that exactly. Niger, they already have an extremely high population, and it'll be up there with India and China. It'll surpass China for sure. Oh, okay. But anyway, where I'm going with this is China's population, of course, skyrocketed, and it was going. They had too many people. They had to limit it. So controlling it was a huge advantage for them. They needed to slow it down. But what's happened in more recent times is that their population growth has slowed down quite a bit. And so, of course, they're the first country to have billions of people, or I guess not billions, but over a billion people. And so they had this huge population boom later than everybody, but that's how they caught up. So with the aid of the U.S. after World War II, that's how they could catch up so fast. They have so many workers, so many people, and that's a huge advantage in some aspects. Also, technologically, you can extract so much data from people. If you have so many consumers and so many people with phones and that are all tracking them and studying them, you can have tons of like so much information compared to if they have 1.3 billion people and we have 300 something million people in the US. That's basically the entire population of the US plus a billion. That's a lot of people. Um, and so it's been advantageous, but their population growth is slowing dramatically. They don't have the freedom that we do. People aren't immigrating to China in droves. They're becoming, they also want had this population boom and wanted to rule the world, and they were smart about it, or they have been smart about it in the aspect that they weren't going to just go out and declare war on the US and try to take over everything like the Nazis did, because that didn't really work out so well, you know. And so they've been sneaky about it. They've said that they're friends with the US and other countries when actually they're not being a very good friend. And so where I'm going with this is if their population is declining a lot, will they perhaps follow the same pattern that these other countries have who had the population boom and tried to take over the world? It's very possible. That to me sounds more possible than a third world war in a direct sense. Um, and metaphysically, oftentimes it's the dark side, which this might sound melodramatic, but it's true. Oftentimes it's the dark side which acts first. It's the light side or the good side, which is happy with the status quo and is just doing their thing and keeping to themselves. So it's the dark side that strategizes first and has the first action and has that advantage um, against the light side. But the dark side is working against the laws of karma. and so it's kind of just a drag on your energy. And oftentimes it's the darkest energies which end up destroying themselves. Or if the lighter side, and not everything is always black and white, of course, but I'm just talking metaphysically on a very abstract level. But on the light side, even if it's late to the game, because they have the laws of karma on their side, they that's a huge advantage. And so again, oftentimes it's the darkest forces that end up destroying themselves. So hopefully that just gives you something to think about. I think my perspective is by no means complete. I do not know everything. There's so much I don't know. I'm sure I'm missing something. I'm sure there's always more to the story. I just think that my narrative seems to make more sense to me than a lot of this thinking that's been going on lately. And I think at the very least, just think about it. You know. So anyway, thanks for listening, and let me know if you have any topics you want to talk about. Just felt like getting this out, but okay. Thanks for listening. I'll see you later.